All right, at long last, this is the drivetrain episode. Basically wanted to walk through what I plan on using for the drivetrain of the buggy and how I plan to put it all together. Not incredibly unusual parts, but a few things that are a little bit different. The motor. Now, yes, it is another LS motor like you'd expect to see, but this one's a little bit unique. This is an LH8 5.3 liter. This came from a Hummer H3 Alpha. This is essentially what they called the 5.3 HO, but it's different than ones like the Trailblazer SS, which now that I say that, I'm not sure those are even 5.3s. But anyway, what this is it's an aluminum block 5.3 with 799 heads, and it's got flat top pistons in it. So it's factory rated 300 horse, 300 foot-pounds of torque. I pulled the ECU or the wiring harness off of it and sent that away with a guy who's actually working on a Hummer, because that harness is unique. So I'll end up getting a standalone harness for this of some sort. But that's where the equation starts. Over here, we have a late model Turbo 400. It's a 32 spline output. This came out of a 87 or 88 Suburban. 2500 Suburban that I believe had a small block in it. What I do inside of the transmission, I'll cover later because I'm still a little bit undecided. And then over here is an NP231J transfer case with slip yoke eliminator. This is what I had in the Jeep for a long time. I will admit it got a little bit noisy there at the end, so when I take it apart, we're going to look into it. This had a shortened input here for the Cherokee AWB4 transmission that I ended up swapping into the TJ, but I put in a 241 6-pinion planetary years ago, and this thing never had any problems with it, so we're going to take it apart here and see how it looks inside. And while we're doing that, a big piece of the puzzle is this 32 spline input and 6-pinion planetary from an NP231C. So this is going to allow us to connect to that Turbo 400. And the weird gap there is going to be made up by this. This is it's aftermarket, but replicates a factory piece. An NP208 transfer case adapter for the Turbo 400. So they had adapters like that at 3 different lengths, depending on the output shaft and the year of the Turbo 400 you have. So it took a minute to figure that out. Off-road design, the guys over there on their tech line helped me pin down exactly what I needed. Here we have the adapter, basically tail housing section. It's gonna fit, keys into the back of the Turbo 400 like that. There is a gasket for it, but on this side is where things get a little more interesting. So on the transfer case, line it up, everything's tilted a little bit right now, but don't mind that. This, I marked the top so the orientation's right. I've just got the transfer case plopped where it wants to sit on the table. But the Chevy 6-bolt pattern is not the same as the Jeep 6-bolt pattern, but it varies only by the difference of one of these studs. So all the studs line up except this one does not. Now, initially, I thought I would take a burr and wallow this hole out, but if I do that, I don't think there's enough space to get a nut on there, and I don't want to take a bunch of the ribbing out. So I think I'm going to end up just pulling one stud, so it will be a 5-stud instead of a 6-stud mount, and put it together. Fitment here. So again, pulled that stud. Everything fits up nice. Clearly made for the same diameter and everything here, so that's great news. All right, case halves are separated. Pretty easy. It's a slip yoke eliminator tail housing. So if you've done a slip yoke eliminator, you know what you're looking at. But basically tail housing, you take out 6 bolts. You undo a couple of snap rings for the speedo gear, which was here. Obviously pulled the speedo gear housing out before I took anything apart. That is your oil pump. And all you do for the oil pump is you take this little tube out. You can get through here with a little flathead. Pops out, no big deal. So let's see what we see in here. So it's the oil pump pickup. It's like a little bit of the old red silicone, which I believe was what the OE used. I used black back when I did the slip yoke eliminator. And this is our magnet. There's a little bit of chunkies in here, so we'll look around, but honestly, it's not that bad for this thing having done more than 10 years in the Jeep as a daily, as a DIY race car, and as a trail wheeler for a real long time, so I'm actually pretty pleased. Now, these two shafts with the tail housing not on, they pull together. There's some alignment there, so you can't check slot truly just by pulling on them like this, because you actually pull them together, but I'll examine the chain, see what it looks like, and look for any wear and tear. So here we have the planetary we took out. This is our 32 spline planetary we're putting in. As you can see, it sticks out quite a bit more, which is going to be just fine. This is our outside case half cleaned up, and this is our inside here cleaned up. So first up, I'm going to get that planetary plopped in there, and then we'll start examining parts as we put them back together. All right, made a colossal mistake here. I did not bolt all these things together or take careful enough consideration to see what they would look like, and obviously the clocking of that just isn't going to work. That when you pull the one stud you have to pull so that the Jeep pattern lines up to the Chevy pattern, it clocks the transfer case like straight down to the ground. The other option is this way, where it clocks the front output up a little bit, not a little bit, quite a bit. Tell you my like a current garage status. Waiting for a clocking ring so I can clock the transfer case down. Can't bolt the transmission to the engine because I'm waiting for the flywheel. Gotta clean up some shit here from swapping the inputs on that. Chassis as far as it needs to be, also I'm out of tube. But my Barnes and Moto-Built packages have arrived. Some Heims, not all of them. Lots of different link brackets, lots of different tabs. Cross-member kit for the transmission, which is actually a lot smaller than I thought it was, so I don't have the right tubing for that. All right, so the 4L60 flywheel is basically lighter duty. You have to oblong the holes to get them to line up to a turbo 400 torque converter. Pretty cheesy, so not gonna do that. So this is basically just reproduction 4L80 flywheel. So it's got the spacer, the flywheel is flat, and the bolt pattern is this 4L80 bolt pattern for the torque converter, which is the same as the turbo 400. So motor and trans should bolt together. I think I'll mock that up now just to check that off the list. So I ordered this clocking ring from Great Lakes 4x4. Clearly a laser cut and tap piece. Let's see if I can fix that. Wifey came out here for some moral support. For this big moment, we have the NP231, the Great Lakes 4x4 clocking ring, which is the Jeep pattern, but the Jeep pattern is asymmetrical, and where I needed to clock it meant that the bolts holes to where the factory studs were didn't line up. Two of them were off. So what I did is MIG welded them shut and then drilled new holes where they needed to be, which I got pretty lucky on some measuring with a ruler and a bunch of garage parts, but pulled that off. And then I took a bigger drill bit, drilled halfway through the plate so that I could countersink an Allen head bolt that I flap wheeled real slim. And so I got all 6 bolts into the transfer case and then 5 studs into the adapter, which it was always gonna be 5 studs because the Chevy pattern's different on one stud. But the adapter here is pretty burly, and I think the 5 studs there are gonna hold. I wasn't super comfortable about only 5 or 4 bolts going into the aluminum transfer case. So now I have 6 into the transfer case, 5 into the adapter. I think that's gonna work. So now I'm gonna play with the front and back, you know, how far rearward the motor's gonna be. Some considerations there is where the rear yoke is compared to the link brackets. That relationship will affect my drive shaft plunge. Out back, up front, not really any incentive to move the motor forward. So basically it's all gonna be based on the rear transfer case there. But the length of the belly pan is perfect. You can see the cross tube down there.
right under the torque converter, which means I can get the pan off and service it in the car, which would be pretty neat. I'll do a cross tube there that's going to pick up the transmission mount, and I'll put bushings on either end of it, and that'll hang that. And then the transfer case, there's a little bit of room here from where the fattest part of the transfer case is to the rear of the tube. So should this transfer case explode someday or be replaced, a lot of other options will fit. So I'll just play with the front to back within a couple inches to get that yoke exactly where I want it, and build the transmission mount. And that'll locate the back of the drivetrain, and I can start building out the front tubes. And so I added this crossbar here. I know aesthetically it'd be nice if it was right next to that, but there is a tiny bit of overlap there, so it's not a totally dead tube. 1 3/4 120 wall running across. The mount for the transmission adapter, there's 2 bolt holes under the ear here. They're like 7 5/8 inches apart. So I made, this is all a little bit hot right now, but made this plate. It's the length. Drilled my holes so the bolts go in. And then I have this bushing that I put in here, and it's gonna allow me to use 2 tabs down to the tube. So I'll show you what that looks like. Here you can see bolted to the mount. This is the tail housing of the transmission adapter, my bushing here, and then 2 tabs going to this cross member. I like this because I still have a flat belly. I obviously am going poly bushing mounting the motor and trans, and I like that this bushing is front to back because when I slot the motor in the car, it goes in from the front. So this should slide in real nice. Centered it up on the tube, which got me the yoke centered coming out of the back of the chassis, and pretty straightforward. Part of what's been tricky is setting the height of everything. So what I have actually is it's part of a sway bar, but it's 5/16 of an inch between the bottom of the oil pan. Again, this motor came from a Hummer H3. I believe they have a oil pan that's unique to them. But I have a spacer there. You can see the height of the transmission. The pan is just below the height of those 1 3/4 cross tubes. But something to keep in mind here is that this angle finder, and basically the drivetrain is at an angle downward, which is common. I think in most vehicles it's around 3 or 4 degrees, according to the interwebs. This one here, I'm at 5 or 6, which a little more angle. I know in TJs and stuff, it's pretty common to lift the motor up to like 8 or 9 degrees to help get rear driveline angles in a more friendly angle. Not worried about driveline angles especially, but I think that's going to be a nice angle for the drivetrain.